Hi, this is Dr. Marshall, and this is the first video of the 1-5 MSQ2 pectoral girdle discussion. And if you're here, I'm assuming you got here by coming to the home page first and then clicking on assignments and then clicking on this assignment, MSQ2, and then recognizing you need a worksheet and the clicking on the Nearpod. And once you're here, joining the lesson, and I've given you a skeleton. This is a fake skeleton, obviously, but it's a model skeleton viewed superiorly with the skull removed to show the pectoral girdle. And what I want you to do with the drawing tool is outline the partial circle of bone formed by the scapulas and the clavicles. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide. Oh, it looks like it wants me to do something. Actually, I'll just go ahead and do my own here. I'm going to use red and outlining one scapula. So there it is outlined, in case you didn't realize that. So I'll go ahead and go to the next slide now. So now that we've dealt with the general divisions of the skeleton, we can start looking at each of the pieces one at a time. First thing we're going to do is look at the appendicular skeleton, and we remember that that is divided into, let me put my email in here so I can type. And we remember it's divided into the pectoral girdle, which we're starting to talk about now, the pelvic girdle, and the bones of the limbs. Okay, so this is how we divide the appendicular skeleton up, the skeleton that hangs off of the axis. And we have two circles of bone, the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle, and the limbs hang off of those. Okay, so again, keep in mind the vision of the pectoral girdle roughly forming a circle of bone that articulates with the sternum anteriorly, and which is anchored to the chest wall and vertebral column posteriorly. And so again, notice the only attachment to the axis is through the small attachment to the sternum. So this is not anchored in very well. There is some posterior anchoring of the pectoral girdle against the posterior chest wall by chest wall muscles, but the only attachment to the actual bony core is the attachment at the, or the articulation at the sternum with the proximal or the medial ends of the clavicles. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So while this circle of bone provides a site of attachment and support for the bones of the upper limb, it's also attached to the axial skeleton loosely enough that the girdle itself is fairly mobile, allowing for great range of motion for itself and for the attached limbs. If you think of a lampshade attached to a lamp. If you loosen the screw holding the lampshade on the lamp, the shade becomes wobbly. And watch this short video clip just to see what I'm talking about. So we have a lampshade, and I'm unscrewing it. And notice how wobbly the lampshade becomes. This is a lot like your pectoral girdle. If you wiggle your shoulders up and down, you can see the similarities in the motion. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So if you wobble your shoulders up and down and picture the motion of the pectoral girdle as being similar to the motion of the loosened lampshade, that could be helpful. Again, recognize that what allows this is the fact that the whole girdle is only attached to the axis at a single point at the sternum. This extended range of motion comes at the expense of stability, and hopefully this should make sense. The more stable I am, the less range of motion I have. The more range of motion I have, the less stable I am. And it's not uncommon for shoulder separations to occur. Okay, you're already aware that the pectoral girdle is formed from just two bones on each side of the body. And those bones are the clavicle and the scapula, or the shoulder blade. So the clavicle or collarbone is a thin, slightly S-shaped bone that extends from the manubrium of the sternum. So here's the sternum, and we call this superior portion of the sternum the manubrium. And this is the medial attachment, and it articulates, moves laterally to articulate with the lateralmost portion of the scapula, and this is the acromion process. So the lateral articulation is at the acromion-clavicular joint. The medial articulation is at the sternoclavicular joint. So it goes from the sternum to the end of the acromion process. So as the region of the articulation with the scapula is also the area where the humerus of the arm, of the upper arm, attaches to the scapula. The clavicle acts as a brace to stabilize the positioning of the shoulder. So if I tighten muscles along the clavicle here and brace this clavicle against the sternum, then the shoulder, the scapula, can also become braced, and movements of the arm will be a lot more effective. They'll not give way as you push with the shoulder, unless your muscles are excessively weak. So this is the idea of a brace. So that's one function we have for the clavicle. The other is that as the scapula moves up and down against the posterior chest wall, so as the scapula moves up and down, the clavicle also acts like a hinge against which the scapula rests to guide this motion. So here we have the hinge, and there we'll have the clavicle moving up and down in an up and down position like that. Okay. The clavicle also anchors several muscles that are important in the motion of the arm, as well as several muscles that participate in head-neck motion. And so you can see here, these are muscles of the head neck. Okay, and these are also muscles that are going to attach to the scapula and basically hold it in place while the scapula, or while the arm can move against it. Okay, so it's there for positioning and movement of the upper limb. Let's go to the next slide. So the clavicle articulates with the sternum at the, we're going to call this the sternoclavicular joint, sternoclavicular. So the sternoclavicular joint. And This is at the superiormost part of the lateral edge of the manubrium. So again, this is the manubrium of the sternum, and this is at the superiormost and lateralmost edge. And the joint is immediately superior to the attachment of the first rib, which is right here. It's immediately above that, and the clavicle sort of hides the first rib, and we can't palpate it directly, because the clavicle is lying over the top of its articulation with the sternum. So the clavicle articulates laterally with the acromion process. Acromion process. Process bone that arches over the superior border of the clavicle. And you can see it kind of peeking out right here, and it looks like it has that arch. So it arches over the superior border of the clavicle as an extension, and the practical, and the scapular spine. This forms the acromioclavicular joint. So let's come over here and spell that. Acromioclavicular. So the acromioclavicular joint. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so that's the clavicle. What about the scapula? So the scapula, or the shoulder blade, is a large triangular shaped bone that has a lot of prominent irregular surface markings that provide many attachments for many muscles. And the interesting thing about this is that if you've ever seen one of these cameras that floats out over a football field, it's attached to a lot of wires, and by pulling on certain wires, I can get it to go in a certain direction to cover a play, or to span the audience, or whatever I want to do with that camera. I can cause it to go wherever I want it to by pulling on one or more of the wires that are holding it. And so this bone, the scapula, is kind of held in place over the back. It kind of floats over the back, suspended between these muscles, and motions of the pelvic, the pectoral girdle basically occurs as a result of the differences in state of contraction of all of the various muscles attached to the scapula. So it's usually this combination of states of contraction that pull the scapula to one side or another, or up or down. Again, much like that camera out over the basketball court or the football field. So actually, why don't we call this video to an end, because we're going to need more time to finish. We'll finish in a second video, so go ahead and stop this one and go to the next one.